Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Book Number 5, Atlantis Station, Chapter 3. It was almost too good to be true, Geordi thought as he slid into his seat. He had half an hour to collect information from the most advanced sensor array on Earth before the cadets would prepare the group report. With that much time, he should have no trouble writing an individual report that would make up the points he had lost earlier. He began with the temperature data. Sensors reported how hot the rocks were, starting at the Earth's surface and going deep underground. Geordi arranged his information into vertical slices through the volcano. Each showed patches of hotter rock near the surface. When he arranged the profiles into a three-dimensional grid, he found the column of molten rock that Leilani had showed them. However, his screen displayed more details. Several fingers of molten rock poked from the center column in various directions. The two largest branches were near the top of the mountain. One seemed to be moving upward as he watched. Geordi rotated the picture, trying to decide if he was imagining the movement. He was so busy that, at first, Geordi didn't realize his chair was shaking. When he looked around, he saw that both clones were holding on to the counter's edge. An earthquake? Geordi wondered, as the shaking stopped. He'd heard about them, but he'd never been in one. Curious, he asked the computer for information about earthquakes and Isla del Fuego. It gave him 3 screens of topics to choose from. Too much data, he thought. Which information would let him predict what the volcano would do? Computer, he ordered, display all earthquakes for the previous month, coded by intensity. A bright, fuzzy patch of dots appeared on the screen. Most were yellow or white, but scattered dots of other colors showed the larger earthquakes. Geordi couldn't see any pattern. Computer, display earthquakes according to time and date. Compression factor 1.5 million. The pixels of light blinked on and off in rapid succession. Geordi still couldn't see any pattern. The points were too random. Computer, have the locations of the earthquakes changed during the last month? Analysis shows a 1.735% upward drift. The level of uncertainty is 5%, and the correlation coefficients are highly variable. Geordi nodded. Measuring precise locations through many kilometers of rock was still not an exact science. Computer, overlay earthquake locations with heat distribution profile. The picture formed on his screen. The earthquake data mapped out a circular area about 2 kilometers beneath the ocean's floor. Geordi's heat profile stopped 4 kilometers above it. Computer, extend heat flow data to 10 kilometers depth. The central column extended downward. When it reached the earthquake zone, the bright yellow stripe expanded into a large bubble. Most of the earthquakes were taking place around its edges. What do they call that? Geordi frowned, trying to remember. Magma chamber? Yes, that's what the geologists called that feature. Magma was their word for molten rock beneath the Earth's surface. A magma chamber was where the liquid rock collected. Motions in the molten rock often caused earthquakes in the solid rock around the magma chamber. Could the volcano on Isla del Fuego be getting ready to erupt? Geordi wondered. What information would help him predict what would happen? The computer listed magnetic surveys, electrical surveys, records of how much the mountain was tilting, and chemical analyses of the gases being released from the volcano. It was far too much information for one person to analyze in the time he had. With a slow grin, Geordi realized the reason for this exercise. With limited time for any mission, everyone had to work together to complete an assignment. Here they were doing the same project. However, on a normal mission, each person would study one aspect of the problem. One person observing the volcano, another collecting plant specimens, a third looking for sea life. Teamwork would give them more data than any single person could collect. It is now time for us to prepare our group report, Tavarian announced. She was acting as chief scientist for the exercise. Stopping beside Geordi, she looked at the information on his screen. You have a great deal of data here, but it is meaningless without informed interpretations. Geordi clenched his hand. Responding to the criticism would only get him into trouble. It looks like the volcano is getting ready to erupt. With more time, I could predict when. Leilani already told us there were fire fountains on the summit. Tavarian's tone made Geordi feel like a 4-year-old, not a very smart one at that. Why do you think your data shows anything more will happen? Data... Geordi repeated her question to himself. Why did he think the volcano was going to erupt soon? His evidence wasn't conclusive, and soon in geological terms might not be for 50 years. Still, there was something he couldn't quite spot, even with the extra powers of his visor. Some piece of evidence was teasing him for attention. He frowned, remembering how hot the top of the mountain had looked when they landed. Was that what was bothering him? Tavarian moved on to the Stenarios clones. You forgot to check how the temperature profiles vary over time, she told Amray. If you had, you would know that these results are worthless. My screen shows that information, Amriel said. It made more sense to create the profiles on my screen, Amray said. Her olive-skinned finger traced the curves on the display. While we ran the analyses on my machine, Amriel continued, finishing her sister's sentence without missing a beat. She pointed to the matching curves on her screen. We agree with Cadet LaForge's suggestion that the volcano will erupt soon, perhaps within the next 2 weeks. That is absolute nonsense. Ben joined the argument, his antennae quivering with irritation. The Academy would never send us on this trip if there was the slightest danger of an eruption. Geordi frowned, looking for the flaw in Ben's logic. Why wouldn't they send us anyway? Especially if they knew something unusual might happen. I mean, when we're officers, we'll have to deal with the unexpected all the time. And, of course, someone who cannot deal with the expected and make it to our shuttle on time can be trusted to deal with the unexpected. Ben's soft, hissing voice made his words sound even more threatening. If you want an excuse to return to the Academy, I am sure the mail shuttle can take you back to dry land. I wasn't looking for an excuse to get out of the trip. From the look on Ben's face, Geordi didn't think the Andorian believed him. He turned back to his screen, fighting to keep from continuing the argument. All natural phenomena show wide random variations. It is normal for this volcano to occasionally display readings similar to the ones the sensors are reporting. Does anyone else disagree with the contents of our final report? Tavarian asked. Or does everyone understand the error the other members of the class made when they assumed high readings meant the volcano was about to erupt? Who gave you permission to ignore us? Geordi thought. He glanced toward the clones, but both Amriel and Amray were staring at their displays. Amriel was drumming her fingers on the control pad, her dark eyes filled with doubt. Amray was as rigid as a pillar of rock. Amriel was thinking about changing her report to match Tavarian's conclusions, Geordi realized. It would look strange if they signed their names to the group's report, saying the volcano was behaving normally, but turned in individual reports that reached the opposite conclusion. Lieutenant Moldov would certainly question their work. Geordi reached for his control pad, then dropped his hand to his lap. No, he whispered. I know I'm right. A fair group report should reflect the work of each team member. The least he could do was be honest and turn in the work he had done. She shouldn't have dismissed our work. This type of problem, Amriel whispered to him. Amray nodded and finished Amriel's thought. Has too many variables for anyone to be absolutely sure of the answers. Geordi grinned at them, glad for their support. Even so, he was relieved when Leilani returned. He logged his work into the main computer and left the lab. With the report on file, he wouldn't be tempted to give in to group pressure and change it later. Chapter 4. Outside, an Airbus was waiting for them. On its side was a bright red logo, the outline of a volcano with the words Isla del Fuego in a circle around it. The cadets climbed into the bus and found seats. Geordi sat in the front behind Leilani. A glance at the controls told him that the trip was directed by the computer. The guide would pause the program to let them spend more time somewhere. Beyond that, they would see the same sights as every other visitor to the island. Disappointed, Geordi fastened his safety harness. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but he wanted their visit to the volcano to be special. Knowing they were getting a standard tour was a letdown. He looked out the window, adjusting his visor to allow for the bright sun. The blocky, angular ends of the lava flows took on sharp edges and deep shadows. The sunlit surfaces read over 50 degrees hotter than the deep cracks between the boulders. Leilani tapped the control pad, and the bus shivered to life. It rose into the air, circling the station. They turned, heading up the mountain. Leilani pointed toward the jagged boulders that Geordi had been looking at. The rough, blocky rock you see is called ah. That's a Hawaiian word. It's spelled with 2 A's, and you say both of them, ah. She gave them a well-timed grin. That's the only easy thing about this stuff. It looks just like the rocks back home, Lissa said. Can't you boulder surf those hills? Leilani shook her head. The gravity here on Earth is over 10 times what it is on Holloway Base. When you jump, you don't move nearly as far. Tavarian looked toward Lissa. The rocks will pick up speed much faster than you are used to. If you do not keep out of the way, they will run you down. That's a good point, Leilani said. Every time you go to a new environment, things change. Even the most basic things, like how high you can jump or how fast a rock will roll down a hill. New places are dangerous when you assume they're like places you already know. Geordi gazed at the broken up rocks and reflected on what a good point Leilani had made. If you live long enough on a planet, you quit thinking about the gravity and how long the days were and how hot the summer was. Sometimes it wasn't easy to adjust to the changes. Both his parents were in Starfleet, and he'd moved around a lot when he was a kid. He'd never gotten used to some of the places they'd lived. The Airbus moved farther up the mountain. The rocks below them became smoother with a twisted rope-like surface. The rocks you are looking at are now Pahoehoe basalt. Leilani said the word slowly and clearly so they could all understand it. Pahoehoe is another Hawaiian word. We Hawaiians have always studied volcanoes with great interest. Several of the cadets laughed. Lissa looked puzzled, not understanding the joke. Geordi decided she must not have taken any geology at the academy. His teacher had talked about the Hawaiian volcanoes for a week. Some classes he'd heard spent even more time studying Hawaii. They continued upward. Leilani talked most of the time. She pointed out the different lava flows, described each one, and gave the history of its eruption. The mountainside was black and empty. From a distance, the rock looked like black syrup frozen into ropes and mounds and rivers. Most areas below were lifeless. In a few places, small, scraggly plants sprouted from cracks in the rocks. We're studying how plants grow on new rock, Leilani said. The wind blows fine dust onto the island, and it's trapped in the rocks. Some plants appear within 50 years of an eruption. Where do the seeds come from? Amory asked. Her face was pressed against the window. There aren't any plants here when the island formed. Amory leaned against her window in an identical position. The seeds were brought here by birds. They eat the berries for food, but they can't digest the seeds. Leilani gave the computer an order, and they swung in a wide arc. A small valley filled with brush appeared beneath them. Geordi's visor picked out a dozen varieties of flora by how the light was reflected off the leaves. The pattern of the plants and rocks looked like a crazy quilt. Even now, we discover at least one new variety every year, Leilani continued. As the plants break down the rocks to form soil, it becomes easier for more plants to grow. They flew past the valley and continued up the mountain. The next valley appeared hotter to Geordi. He tried to check the different ranges from his visor, but the heat reflected from the black rocks looked very much like heat coming from beneath the surface. Before he could decide which was which, they were over the next ridge and heading for the summit. The last slope was the steepest. The whine from the engines rose to a shrill pitch as the bus climbed the last few meters. The ground flattened at the top. The bus landed a safe distance from the crater. A cloud of steam rose ahead of them. The ground was covered with small reddish chunks of rock. The door opened, letting in a blast of air that smelled of rotten eggs. "What's that horrid smell?" Lissa asked, scowling. "That smell is sulfur from the volcano," Tavarian said. She moved quickly for the door, with Ven close behind her. By the time Geordi got outside, both were looking over the edge. They were arguing about the best way to reach the floor of the crater. "You will not go down there!" Leilani's voice cracked like a whip. "No one goes down there without proper equipment, and that's after they get permission from the director." The rocks crunched beneath Geordi's boots. He bent down and picked one up. It was a couple of centimeters in diameter and full of holes. "We wish to study the volcano to the best of our ability." Tavarian's tone sounded reasonable. "We must get closer to do this. You are keeping us from doing our assignment." Geordi rolled a piece of rock in his hand. The sharp edges cut into his hand like glass. When he looked closer, he saw that it was glass. A thin coating of iron oxide, much like rust, covered the unbroken surfaces. "No!" Leilani stood her ground, acting as though she dealt with unreasonable cadets every day. "Anyone who steps over that edge will be expelled from Starfleet Academy immediately." Geordi hurried forward, curious to see why his classmates were so eager to climb into the crater. More rocks crunched under his boots and scattered ahead of him. A gust of hot, sulfur-laden air hit him as he reached the top. At his feet, the ground dropped away. Sheer cliffs surrounded the bowl-shaped crater. 3 fire fountains, one more than they had been told, played near the opposite wall. The crater's floor was almost 200 meters below. Startled, Geordi stepped back. "True samurai must never show sign of fear." Yoshi moved to the crater's edge. "Force of nature is not dangerous like honorable opponent in battle." "Tell that to the people who get killed in natural disasters," Geordi muttered. Try as they might, scientists still couldn't predict every major earthquake or hurricane or flood. Each year, people were killed because they ignored the warnings or because they weren't warned in time. Geordi decided to play it safe. He could see well enough from where he was. Each fire fountain was throwing molten rock. It was called lava, he reminded himself, almost as high as the rim of the crater. The streams of lava looked like water squirting from a hose. At the base of each fountain, the lava was bright red, but it turned black as it cooled. The drops of rapidly cooling rock crashed and tinkled on the ground like china plates dropped onto the floor. Larger blobs of still molten lava made dull plops when they landed. Geordi wiped the sweat from his forehead. It was hard to believe it was so hot this far from the eruption. "You're interfering with my right to practice my religion," Ben said. He was shouting to be heard over the clattering rocks. "The observance of the flames is central to all 5 major Andorian religions." Wondering what would happen next, Geordi looked away from the fire fountains. Ven and Tavarian had split, with one on either side of Leilani. "First, religious ceremonies on Isla del Fuego are restricted by the research station's charter. You must have permission from the director." Leilani crossed her arms over her chest and stared at Ven. The Andorian flushed a darker shade of blue. "I protest most strongly. I have the right under the Federation Charter to practice my religion." "Granted." Leilani's face relaxed into an "I've got you" grin. Her teeth flashed against her tanned skin. "However, you're also a Starfleet cadet on an Academy assignment. As such, you can be dismissed from the Academy if you ignore my orders." A tremor shook the mountain. Geordi felt the ground tilting beneath his feet. Rocks broke loose and fell into the crater. They clattered all the way down. Another tremor hit, and Geordi felt himself skating toward the cliff. Something moved off to one side. He looked that way and saw Yoshi sliding over the edge. Geordi threw himself flat and dug his toes into the loose rock. He reached for Yoshi, barely catching his hand. Yoshi's body swung into the cliff. The impact twisted Geordi's shoulder and jerked him toward the edge. Digging his toes farther into the loose rock, Geordi brought his other hand forward to grab Yoshi. The weight dragged him closer to the edge. The rocks beneath him vibrated with an ominous cracking. "Hurry! It's giving way!" Yoshi struggled, his body swinging like a pendulum. Geordi pressed himself harder against the ground, but he kept sliding. His hands hung over empty air, then his arms folded. Just as he knew he was going to fall, Geordi felt strong hands around his ankle. Moments later, another pair of hands grabbed his other ankle. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Leilani and Tavarian were holding his feet. They pulled, dragging him backward inch by inch. He tightened his grip on Yoshi, hoping he could hang on until they were both safe. The rough pebbles cut into him, scraping his skin. The cracking sounds became louder. Yoshi's head appeared above the cliff. The girls jerked on Geordi's legs, and Yoshi popped over the edge. Leilani and Tavarian dropped Geordi's ankles. "Run!" Leilani ordered. She and Tavarian dashed for the airbus. The ground shook harder. Geordi rolled over and got to his knees. Behind him, he heard the scatter of pebbles as Yoshi scrambled to his feet. The ground heaved drunkenly beneath him. Geordi didn't bother to stand. Pushing off like a sprinter coming off the starting blocks, he lit out for the airbus. Yoshi was 2 steps behind him. They threw themselves through the door. As Geordi stumbled to his seat, Leilani ordered an emergency liftoff. The bus jumped into the air, shoving him deep into the padding. Beneath them, the side of the mountain crumbled and slid into the crater. Even through the walls of the airbus, the grinding and banging of the moving rocks were deafening. Clouds of dust made it impossible to see anything. Geordi shivered, thinking how close they had come to being buried beneath the rock slide. From the silence in the bus, he decided his classmates were also shaken by the close call. He tightened his safety harness. For the moment, he was content to let the computer fly them back to the research station. Back at the station, Leilani showed Geordi and his classmates to the cafeteria. He didn't notice until they were eating that she'd left the room. Geordi nibbled on his sandwich. He knew he should eat it, but he wasn't hungry. His narrow escape had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He studied his classmates, comparing their actions with what his visor told him. Ben was angry, and Geordi guessed he was still upset about not being allowed into the crater. The Stenarios clones were withdrawn, locked in their own world. Geordi saw the sideways looks and the small signals they gave each other, but he didn't know what they meant. Tavarian appeared calm, but Geordi's visor told him that her body temperature was down, a sure sign of stress. Yoshi also pretended that nothing was wrong, but his hands were shaking. Lissa and Todd had been farthest from the crater, and Geordi couldn't tell how the experience had affected them. They were talking to each other in low tones, too softly for Geordi to hear. With a shrug, he turned his attention back to his sandwich. Finally, Yoshi spoke, giving Geordi a deep bow from the waist. "One must thank honorable classmate Geordi for saving worthless life. Deepest gratitude is humbly expressed." You're welcome, Yoshi," Geordi swallowed. "But I didn't do it alone. Leilani and Tavarian had to pull me out, or we both would have fallen." Yoshi turned to Tavarian and gave her a deep bow. "Deepest gratitude is also extended to honorable classmate Tavarian for assistance in rescue." Tavarian raised one eyebrow. For a moment, Geordi was afraid she would give them a lecture on human failings. Instead, she nodded. "It is only logical to save the lives of one's crewmates. Starfleet does not approve of needless loss of life among its trained officers." Suddenly, Geordi felt a lot better. Tavarian's lack of feeling should have been depressing, but it had the opposite effect. Maybe because that's what you expect her to say, he thought. Maybe he was beginning to understand her. Whatever the reason, he was suddenly hungry. He polished off a sandwich and went back for another. Leilani returned while he was finishing his cookies. She pulled a chair up to the end of the table and sat facing them. I have been talking with the director about what happened this morning. You're all aware that every Starfleet assignment is a journey into the unknown. None of us knows when we may have a brush with death, such as we did this morning. Leilani paused, waiting for her words to sink in. Geordi thought she looked tired, as if the morning's excitement had taken more out of her than it had from the rest of them. The director talked with your teacher a few minutes ago. Lieutenant Moldov insisted that you should continue your tour. He said that on a real mission, no Starfleet officer has the option of giving up when things become a little dangerous. She drew in a deep breath as though trying to steady herself. Why is she so tense? Geordi wondered. Lieutenant Moldov's reaction was exactly what he had expected. In a moment, he heard the answer. The director, however, feels you should be given the option to finish this trip later. In principle, she agrees that a real mission must continue. However, this morning you saw more danger than many Starfleet officers meet in a full tour of duty. It's unfair to treat such an experience as a routine training assignment. Todd straightened in his chair. If Lieutenant Moldov says we should finish the trip, what's the problem? What are we waiting for? Leilani looked at each of them, paused for a moment, and then went on. She reached Geordi and stopped, studying his face. He read the question coming from her expression. Did he feel like continuing? He thought for a moment, then nodded. We're here, and it seems like it would be easier to finish the tour now. I think it might be harder to come back later. The others nodded in agreement. Tavarian summed up their feelings best. If we are to become Starfleet officers, we must act like Starfleet officers. It is illogical for us to expect easier treatment as cadets than we will receive as officers. That doesn't mean we can't be nervous, Geordi thought. After this morning, he would see routine assignments in a much different light. When mountains crumbled beneath your feet, nothing in the universe was completely certain. He was still thinking about that 15 minutes later when they headed back for the Aqua shuttle. Even so, what else could go wrong? They'd used a year's supply of bad luck that morning. This afternoon, everything would be just fine.